We're both wondering where the fire is. I'll like create one over here.
Butch said the fire's inside.
There you go. All righty. How's lunch? It's good? Yeah. All righty. So good afternoon. Thank you guys for allowing us to spend time with you. I am Katie Phang. I am one of the newest anchors and hosts for Peacock and for MSNBC. Very proud to have my own show, The Katie Phang Show, and very pleased and honored to have been asked to participate in this fireside chat with Connecticut Attorney General William Tong. So I would like to start by, he's saying hi to everybody. I'd like to actually start by asking whether or not your parents are disappointed that you're not a doctor or a lawyer right now. Well, you're still a lawyer, but you're not practicing law.
There are many different levels of disappointment. I don't think it's professional. No, you know what's interesting? Obviously, my parents, as immigrants, as small business owners,
Yes.
growing up in a Chinese restaurant, I don't think that they pictured this for me, for us, for our family. But on top of growing to embrace it, I think as immigrants, and now you see what I think under the previous president was a war on America's immigrants. I think they have really begun to understand and now understand the imperative of service, and that when good people do nothing, bad things happen, and they really viscerally get that. And so for me, the recognition was one night in 2008. I was with my dad, and I, like many Asian American and Pacific Islander sons, have a challenging relationship with my dad. We don't always have a heart-to-heart about things. I love my dad, but it's tough. I think you know what I'm talking about. But he looked at me late in the campaign and he said, "We need Barack Obama to win." And I said, "Yeah, he'd be a great president, right? The country needs Barack Obama." And he said, "No, we need Barack Obama to win." And what he was saying was people of color in our community always butting up against the bamboo ceiling. He represented a big wall coming down for us, and that my dad understood that. And he was a Nixon Republican, by the way, back in the day. And there's a lot of historical reasons for that. But because he viscerally understood that and it was really important to him, I think was a huge step for us as a family and embracing this crazy life that we're in.
So you're the 25th Attorney General of the state of Connecticut. You're also the first Asian American elected to statewide office. And you talk about that bamboo ceiling. But just a couple of minutes ago, you talked about the fact that there's this need to kind of step up and actually have a voice during a time that's particularly challenging when, for example, in the last administration, there was just so much divisive hatred and so much negative sentiment going on. How did that work, though, being first-generation American? Because it kind of flies in the face culturally of how the stereotype is for Asian Americans, right? The idea that Asian Americans are not the ones that are necessarily going to be rallying in the streets. They're not the ones that are going to carry the banner. We're the ones that are just going to work really hard behind the scenes to get the job done. But now you have stepped into a very visible role. So do you feel like you've come into your own in that way? Do you feel like it's run counter a little bit to the way that you were perhaps raised?
Yeah, I wasn't raised that way. And so I do feel like these are stereotypes. Certainly these stereotypes don't pertain in Asia, right? I mean, in Asia, people who look like us are leaders and captains of industry and rabble-rousers and revolutionaries. And as a Chinese American, I mean, if you look to China's recent 100-year history, they're not afraid of politics over there. No. So, and frankly, rebellion either. And I say this when people suggest these stereotypes, and they're there. I don't mean to suggest that they're not there, and that there isn't some place where these stereotypes come from, good and bad. But I remind people that my parents, you said, would your dad have $2.40?
$2.43 when he came to the United States from Korea.
So
that's all he had. It's
something about that experience that people remember how much money they had. My dad had 57 cents.
There you go.
And all my parents have ever done was fight every single day, 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. And they didn't have time to be afraid or meek or quiet or shy. They rocked the boat every single day, right, in that Chinese restaurant. And because there was stuff flying at them, and not all of it good, by the way, right? I mean, as a small business owner in suburban Connecticut, a lot of racism, a lot of hate, encountering a lot of obstacles. People give you a hard time when you try to pull a building permit, for example, right? Or when you're trying to get relatives to come over and so they can start a new life and get them into local schools or get them a place to live. All of these experiences are familiar. They're hard. And, they never back down from any of those fights. So my role models, my stereotype, if you will, are these tough as nails immigrants that don't take anything from anybody.
And you have 3 children, 16, 13, and 10. The 2 oldest are girls. The youngest is a boy. How much do you think that cultural identity is still being carried on and passed along, seeing how, like me, I have a daughter who's 7. I don't necessarily spend a lot of my day emphasizing the fact that I'm from Korea. My parents were from Korea. So do you find that you consciously have to do that? Do you find it's helpful that your parents are still around to be able to facilitate that? Do they facilitate that?
Yes, all of that. My parents are very present in our lives. My mom is with us 3 days a week. And so my sisters hate this, but there's 5 of us. I'm the eldest and I'm the only boy. And so it's 2022. Those traditional gender dynamics do not pertain in my family. My sisters made sure of that. But I can't tell you that I don't benefit from time to time in calling on my mom to do a little extra for us. And so she does. And so they've spent a lot of time with their grandmother. As with us, my mom fell down on the job with the Chinese language instruction. So my Mandarin and Cantonese are not good. And my kids don't speak very good Chinese either. But, the other cultural observances, Chinese New Year, Chinese food, the way that we interact and relate to our extended family, all of that is present. It's probably not as strong as it was a generation before. But what's interesting when you ask that question, if you asked at least my 16-year-old how she identifies, and her mom is Elizabeth Hotchkiss Tong. Okay, so I joke, the first Elizabeth Hotchkiss came to New Haven, Connecticut on a ship from England in 1639. They went to Pennsylvania, and she returned to Connecticut 400 years later, married to a Chinese guy. But if you ask Eleanor how she identifies as Asian American, as Chinese American. But I think it's a different Asian American than we were when we grew up. I think it's a much more global view of being an Asian American, a Pacific Islander. I think she pictures herself a citizen of a community that isn't just limited to Hartford, Connecticut, but that she has a kinship with APAICS across the globe. And that's experience that I didn't have, right? I think they're very lucky to have that.
But do you think as parents, do you think that we've fallen asleep at the switch a little bit though? Because I feel like there's other cultures that continuously emphasize as the continuing generations build and build the history. and the traditions that are specific to those particular cultures and those races. Do you think that we, as Asian American Pacific Islanders, are so intent upon assimilating and integrating to be able to be a part of what this world is, or specifically in the United States, that perhaps we're horse trading a little bit? We're having to like put it aside a little bit or shelve it because we're trying so hard to assimilate and be integrated.
Those are big questions. And all of us have gone through, many of us have gone through this process of reckoning with our identity and our place in America, particularly those of us who went to Northeastern liberal arts colleges and universities. You know, it's this process, and those are predominantly white institutions, right? And at least they were when we went there in New England. Much more now, much more diverse, many more Asians there, many more Asians from Asia in these institutions. So they're very different places. But it's an interesting question. And I did a Zoom last night with the Chinese American Heritage Foundation, and this question about assimilation came up. And my approach and my advice, and when people ask, how do we confront anti-Asian hate, and how do we confront this recent increase in hate crimes and violence and murder, one of the things I encourage people do is to help make us more visible, right? Because being an Asian American and Pacific Islander is to be invisible in this society, and in this national reckoning about race and racism and hate. We are routinely left out of it, except when something happens on the news, right? But we're routinely left out of that conversation. And so I think it's really important to lean into who we are and be visible and demonstrate and talk about who we are and our background and our culture, and everything from the holidays we celebrate to what we eat, to, more substantive, ingrained cultural norms in our culture, and just be who we are, and don't try to pretend to be somebody you're not. And I have found, as an elected official, that if I do that, if I talk about 57 cents, if I talk about growing up as a son of immigrants, if I talk about working side by side with my parents in our Chinese restaurant, what you realize is other non-Asian people have similar experiences in the Latino and Hispanic community, for example, in the quote unquote white ethnic communities, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans. There are stories that we have, and that are similar to their stories, but you can only figure that out if you tell them. And so the one thing that really resonated with me over the last couple of years was, you may recall, Amara Walker of CNN was in New Orleans at the airport, and somebody shouted racist epithets at her in the airport and attacked her. And so she went on Twitter to talk about that experience growing up as a Korean American, right? How she always felt deeply American, right, at her core, also Korean at the same time. And in a defiant tone talked about how much she has every right to this country, its institutions and traditions and society and culture, and how she is every bit a part of America as anybody else. And she said, "I'm as American as Korean barbecue." And that, I thought, was a beautiful way to put it, because I'm as American as shrimp fried rice. And we sold a heck of a lot of shrimp fried rice for me to be sitting here today. And that's what I hope people, let's not buy into these old, what I think are almost racist tropes about assimilating and integrating. Let's just be who we are and recognize that that's as American as anybody else.
So your office is an elected position. So it's not like you got appointed by the governor, for example. So when you decided to run for office, did you feel like you had to prepare and campaign in a way and through a lens that was different than perhaps if you were not Asian American?
So it was certainly suggested to me. So my friend Peter Riang, Korean American, high school and college classmate, parents added an R to the front of their last name, Yang, to make it Riang, to anglicize it. And that's not to be critical. People did these things back in the day, right? We all have friends and maybe family who did that. We were having lunch. I was going to ask him for money. And we were having lunch, and we were very close. And he said, maybe you should take your wife's name in this campaign.
And be William Hotchkiss?
William Hotchkiss.
Tong, or just William Hotchkiss?
No, just William Hotchkiss. And I said, Pete, he's Korean. I said, Pete, why would I do that? He said, well, you're running in Connecticut. There are almost no Asian people. Maybe you can run as William Hotchkiss and hide the fact that you're Asian.
Hide it.
And I said to him, Pete, look at me. I'm quite sure they know. And so no, I've never run as anything, I hope, as anything that I'm not. I lean into the fact that I'm an Asian American, a Pacific Islander, and a Chinese American. And I talk about, as I said before, my experiences and my upbringing. And I find that more often than not, that resonates with people in good ways, either because they have a similar story or because they honor the struggle of immigrants and my parents and how we did it. Of course, at the same time, I was born and raised in Hartford, Connecticut. And, I speak the language. I'm a native. And so I don't look, do people otherize me and see me as a perpetual foreigner? And do I get attacked on Twitter by hateful racist trolls? Of course I do, right? I'm a public figure. But I think by and large, again, I was born in Hartford Hospital. I'm as Connecticut as anybody else.
So let's talk about your Twitter presence, but more broadly, let's talk about the role that you're serving as the Attorney General of Connecticut. You're the, quote, top cop. I mean, you are the top law enforcement official in the state of Connecticut, but you haven't been contented to just kind of sit back and do whatever duties and responsibilities would traditionally come with your role as the AG. You actually are out there. You are very visibly out there leading the charge, trying to combat, anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment, trying to combat, racism, not just directed to the AAPI community. You are very active in the Roe v. Wade, Dobbs decision that's going to be coming out in a few months. Do you find that you get pushback for doing that because you are not, like I said, you're not just sitting there doing your job and checking in and, clocking in at 9 to 5. You're really leading the charge and trying to say we need to change the dialogue and be a little bit more aware and a little bit more decent about who we are as human beings.
So I get asked this question a lot, and sometimes I'm accused of being an activist. And that's a common criticism, particularly of Democratic attorneys general, that we're activist attorneys general. And my predecessor, Richard Blumenthal, who is our senior senator, was for 20 years a giant in the AG community and was an activist. What I say to people is, yes, we're engaged in all of the big fights. Which one do you want me to sit out?
Yeah, how would you ever?
Yeah, what you want me to? You want me not to be an activist? You want me to stay out of the fight to preserve a woman's right to choose an abortion? Do you want me to, sit down when there's a rash of anti-Asian hate across the country? Do you want me to not engage against Facebook, Meta, Instagram, TikTok when there's so much harm being done to kids here in America and nobody's holding them accountable? I mean, which fight do you want me to take a breather on?
That's a great question.
None of them.
Because the answer is none.
Right. And so my job is to set priorities in the largest law firm in Connecticut, which is my office, and to say, okay, we have all of these huge, often existential battles that we have to engage upon. And let me just back up for a second. Why is it my problem? Well, I think 30 years ago, you might expect Congress to do something about it, right? You would look to your senators and representatives, and they would actually introduce a bill that would become a law, and they would pass a budget, and we would address economic, social, political problems in the legislative process. As Congress, in large portions, lies broken today, the fights devolve to the states because states are like, well, they're not going to handle it. And so, for example, I lead the national generic drug price fixing case. That's Connecticut's case. It's nearly a 50-state coalition. We're doing that because the generic drug manufacturers, who are responsible for providing 90% of our nation's prescriptions, are fixing prices brazenly. They're calling each other up and they're saying, hey, Katie, let's set the price of doxycycline, 8,000% higher than it needs to be. And then I say, okay, yeah, let's do that. Sure. And Congress is unable to pass legislation to make them stop. And so the only answer is for the states in our federal system. Now I'm nerding out a little bit, but in our federal system, the states then exercise our prerogative to file lawsuits. And this happens if it's a 50-state coalition, it's Democrats and Republicans. We do it together.
So to that point, today is a big day in a lot of states. There's a lot of primaries going on. We're all watching very carefully, regardless of the side of the aisle that you find yourself on. It's an interesting concept because we are at a loggerheads in Congress right now, down the street, right? You want them to do it. They're not doing it. This Dobbs decision, for example, is highlighting the fact that the states are now going to drive a lot of what happens to us as people for our individual liberties. Do you think then we have reached that point in our arc politically that offices like yours, the attorney general of a state, maybe even a school board position, right? Maybe these state level positions are actually now going to be more important and more critical than what aspirationally maybe people had wanted to do. Maybe you wanted to be a United States senator from the great state of Connecticut, but maybe you have more power to change people's lives as the attorney general of the state of Connecticut.
I don't know in relative terms who's more important than the other. All I would say is that states are no longer the laboratories of democracy. They're really the only places where any work gets done. And that is maybe a sad commentary about Washington. But if you look at the ability of governors and state legislatures, so I'll give you an example. Before I became Attorney General, I was in the legislature, and I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. And Connecticut has a horrible relationship with gun violence, as you know, in Newtown. And after we lost 26 souls in Newtown, we couldn't wait for Congress to pass basic things like universal background checks. Never going to happen. And so I was part of a small group of legislators who wrote and passed the post-Newtown gun laws, which are the strongest in the country. And then I wrote and passed the domestic violence gun law, which is now popularly known as a red flag law. I couldn't have done that in Washington. We did that in Hartford. And that's because our state legislature still largely functions. And so I have great respect for our congressional delegation and our senators and congressmen. They're hugely important in Connecticut, but I don't think I would. I don't think I'd want a different job than the one I have now.
Do your constituents contact you and tell you what they think are the important issues of today? I think we all kind of, especially we're guilty of this in the media, and I'll group myself in the media. I was explaining to the Attorney General, I'm a refugee from the law. I was practicing full time until literally 2 months ago. But I think in the media, we're guilty of, kind of trying to drive the narrative of what's important to people. Do you hear from your constituents and they tell you, I don't care about this. I really care about the fact that I have to choose between paying for the bus or having gas to be able to put food on the table to go to my job? Like, are they telling you what they think are the important issues right now?
Yeah, and increasingly, they get it. They get that AGs are nimble. They get that AGs have, particularly elected AGs, have the ability to make decisions on our own, and that we can file lawsuits. And so, having figured that out, right, we get tons of calls on a variety of issues. Baby formula shortage. Like, do something, William. Sue somebody, right? And because they get it. They're like, you can throw a punch in a way that my mayor can't, right? Or my state legislator can't. So we get that all the time. Now, unfortunately, people usually think we can do a lot more than we can actually do. And litigation is no way to set policy, by the way, right? It only happens because other people aren't setting policy. It is expensive. It takes a long time. It's very contentious, but we do it because somebody has to do something.
So we're down to about a little bit under 4 minutes and 30 seconds left for the time that we have for our fireside chat. We did want to open it up to any Q&A. We're such a small room. So if you guys have any questions for the Attorney General, please raise your hand. Anybody? If not, we'll just keep on going. We have a lot to talk about.
Hi, Lorna.
Oh, please. Is there?
I don't know. Nice to see you. Thank you.
I wanted to take a minute because you mentioned your predecessor, which is Senator Blumenthal now. And I don't know that a lot of people know this. I happen to know him as well. But it's so important that I think not in addition to fostering your leadership, he was really behind the scenes as the chairman of the committee that put forth, right, the anti-hate law.
Mm-hmm.
Acknowledging Asian Americans for the first time on par with Irish Americans and Hispanics in the White House is a really big step. So, could you comment a little bit about sort of like this idea of working in partnership with other Americans to move these important balls forward for our community?
So extraordinarily important, and this couldn't happen without your work, Lorna, for example, at the Leaders Forum, without your work, Katie, as a journalist, and all of us standing up on our own, and when I'll just share with everybody that when the 6 women were murdered in Georgia, Lorna and her husband called me and said, you have to do something. No, you did. And, but it's in those moments that we have to stand up on our own, right? And we can't be in partnership with other communities, including communities of color, unless we are seen as peers. And we have equal access and seats at the table. And this is still a problem. And let me tell you about a really difficult experience for me. After I got elected as Attorney General, I went to San Diego. And I was in a room with only other attorneys general. So there were about 18 of us. It was Democrats, but we were together in a room, and it was an AG only meeting, and we got a 3-hour presentation from an eminent civil rights lawyer who gave a 3-hour presentation on the history of race, racism, hate, discrimination, Jim Crow. 3 hours. It was a wonderful, comprehensive presentation. When it was done, and I was sitting right there, like right in front. When it was done, he had to catch a plane. And so he was running to the elevator, and I ran after him. And I said, "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" And he said, "Yes, Mr. Attorney General, what can I do for you?" I said, "That was really great. You talked for 3 hours about race, racism, and hate in this country and the civil rights movement." He said, "Yes." I said, "You didn't once mention Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders." And he looked at me with that like, holy shit look on his face. I said, "Vincent Chin, Japanese internment, Chinese Exclusion Act, not a word." And this was in a progressive room, right, with a very progressive person. And I think my job, Lorna, is to always insist in those spaces and in public spaces, hello, we're here too. And we have every right to speak about issues of concern to our community on equal footing. And so last week's event at the White House, that was a great event, great food, Rose Garden, all that. No, that was about equal footing. That was about respect, right? And so that when we sit down and have a conversation about substantive issues, you hear me, right? And I'm not an afterthought.
I mean, we've got more questions. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, of course, there's hope, and of course, a lot is being done. We talked about the COVID-19 anti-Asian hate law that I was proud to see signed by the president, and we're pumping resources into fighting hate, including hate against Asian Americans. There's the law enforcement response, which is real, right? And then there's trying to intercede hate online and social media. That's also real. But let me say it also makes a huge difference for you to step up as an activist and to speak and to show that you're fighting, and for Katie to talk about these issues on her show and use her platform, and for me to use my platform. Because at the end of the day, this is not new, right? What is really frustrating to me is when people are like, allies, friends. William, I'm so sorry that this is happening to your community. I can't believe that it's happening. And my response is, why can't you believe it? It's been happening for a long time, right? Unless you don't know about Vincent Chin or the internment of 125,000 Japanese Americans. And I don't have to tell you that part of the reason I am certain that you were pushed into the water is because of social stereotypes about you and about whether they can get away with it, right? Or are the stereotypes about Asian women that you're meek, that you're quiet, you're highly objectified, over-sexualized, all of those things contribute to making you unsafe. Of course they do. And so we have to fight back against that in order to change those stereotypes and that narrative so that not only does it not happen to you, but it doesn't happen to my 16-year-old, my 13-year-old.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I mean, I'm routinely accused on Twitter of being an agent of the Chinese Communist Party.
Oh, me too. Just this morning.
Yeah. But are you called the Manchurian AG?
No,
Yeah,
I don't get that luxury. No.
That's a good one. This is a very real problem, the so-called China Initiative, for example, in the name of national security, targeting Chinese Americans and Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. All of that is very real and very scary. And I think we just have to call it out for what it is and stand up to it. Couple things. One is in Connecticut, we just passed a law requiring the teaching of Asian American and Pacific Islander history in our schools.
In your schools.
And that's not just to make us feel good about our history, right? That's to make sure that people understand in Connecticut, for example, that Chinese Americans fought on behalf of the Union in the U.S. Civil War. We didn't all come in the 70s, right? The first Asian American admitted to any bar in the United States was Hong Yen Chang, and he was admitted to the New York bar, by the way, and came through Hartford, Connecticut. And this happened in the 1800s too. And so knowing this history and, of course, the much bigger history around internment, right, and our immigration patterns and all these different attributes and facts in our history are important to share because, A, they're part of American history, number one. Number two, it explains our contributions to this country and developing it into the greatest nation on earth. We have a role in that, okay? And we should claim and must claim that we had a role in that so that people understand we're not perpetual foreigners. We've been here for a very long time, and we're part of the building blocks of this country. And until people get that, you're still going to have this hate and prejudice directed at us and this xenophobia. That's very real.
We've unfortunately run out of time. I do want to thank all of you for being so attentive and for making us feel like we're really hanging out having our fireside chat. Please give a round of applause for the Connecticut Attorney General, William Tong. Thanks, everybody. And if you're participating in tonight's event, it begins at 5 o'clock. But between now and then, I believe that you guys have free time. So go and enjoy.